There seems to be one underlying individual fate-transcending theme by which both the major and the minor events that take place in Game of Thrones are swayed. But despite the decades that have passed since the first book of A Song of Ice and Fire came out, and the number of theories that have surged since then, what exactly the theme of Ice and Fire encompasses remains a mystery. What is the Song of Ice and Fire? How did it come into existence, and what will it mean for the future continuation of the story? In this video, I'll attempt to assemble and dissect evidence from the books and conduct a mythological analysis to present you with some possible answers. So, to begin with, we'll first look at what the symbolism of Ice and Fire represents in the series and what it'll mean for the future of the story. We have to look at specific eras in Game of Thrones and deduce from the abstract symbolism some concrete interpretations for the story. If we look at our main storyline, throughout the story, apart from the abstract interpretation of Ice and Fire and the phenomena described, we come across its very specific manifestations. It's quite obvious that Ice and Fire represents a theme recurring throughout the history of the world of Game of Thrones, whose importance shouldn't be underestimated, and there's a vast body of evidence for that. For example, it's been assimilated into language and given an important position there. We can see it appear in the oath sworn by the reed, and we have evidence that this oath is very, very old. We swear it by ice and fire. They finish together. As the reeds finish, Bran finds himself groping for words, as it's not an oath he had been taught. This, and the fact that the reeds had first sworn their fealty thousands of years ago, indicate that ice and fire were considered the most important symbols to swear by, as it's A, set together by the people who are swearing the oath, and B, it's the climax of the oath. Also, the branches forming the top level of Khal Drogo's funeral pyre were laid north to south, from ice to fire. The Long Night and the Doom. The world has known ice in the Long Night, and it has known fire in the Doom. The Long Night was a season of winter that lasted a generation. The tales say that sun only returned when a hero persuaded the children of the deity Mother of Roin to stop fighting, and guess what? To sing a secret song that brought back the day. What does the prophecy of the Song of Ice and Fire mean then? That the one, or ones, whose song it'll be, will bring peace, either by uniting the seven kingdoms against the others, or the seven kingdoms with the others, or first the west and then the east, who knows, but his purpose is the same in any case. A tale told by the Ashai is the one of Azor Ahai, who vanquished the darkness brought about by the Long Night with his blazing sword Lightbringer. The Yeti also say that the Age of Darkness was ushered in by the Bloodstone Emperor, who slew his sister, the Amethyst Empress, out of jealousy. He was supposedly a dark magician with cannibalistic tendencies who practiced torture and necromancy, much like Euron Greyjoy, for which I believe he'll play a crucial role in the future. Other tales hold the others responsible for the never-ending winter. Supposedly, they brought cold and darkness from the frozen land of Always Winter. Some tell of an alliance formed between the Children of the Forest and the first men of the Night's Watch, who fought together against the others in the Battle of the Dawn, winning and making the others flee back. Sometime after the Battle of the Dawn, Valyria rose, but it was also eventually destroyed in an event known as the Doom, which was caused by eruption of the great volcanic mountains known as the 14 Flames. Here, ice and fire represent two sides of the same coin. We can see ice and fire as alternating seasons, which both end in a disaster, followed by rebirth. Whether it's winter or summer, they reach a zenith of anarchy, in which something's destroyed and something survives, only for the next following cycle to begin with something new being born. For example, the Long Night was followed by the rise of Valyria, and the Doom was followed by the rise of House Targaryen in Westeros. In both cases, too much of one of the two resulted in a disaster. Both ice and fire are needed, as you can't have an eternal day or an eternal night, but they must be maintained in balance, and that'll again be the purpose of the rebirth of Azor Ahai. He's supposed to unite ice and fire against the darkness. Whether he'll be called Azor Ahai or the prince that was promised makes no difference, as the principle of the two forces set against each other will remain the same, no matter who will embody them. All the tales agree that the darkness didn't go away on its own, but had to be fought against and vanquished, so it certainly wasn't simply due to an astronomical phenomenon. We can, however, compare it to something like being stuck in the winter solstice, the shortest day and the longest night of the year, which is celebrated by various cultures across the world as it marks the symbolic death and rebirth of the sun. Dualism. Now that we've established that ice and fire are yin and yang of the world of A Song of Ice and Fire, let's have a look at some evidence in the present storyline that confirms this. Because they're different, he insisted, like night and day or ice and fire. If ice can burn, then love and hate can mate. Mountain or marsh, it makes no matter. The land is one. The way the world is made, the truth is all around you, plain to behold. The night is dark and full of terrors, the day bright and beautiful and full of hope. One is black, the other white. There is ice and there is fire, hate and love, bitter and sweet. Male and female, pain and pleasure, winter and summer, evil and good, death and life. Everywhere opposites, everywhere the war. There are two, not seven, not one, not 100 or 1,000, two. The war has been waged since time began, and before it is done, all men must choose where they will stand. On one side is R'hllor, the Lord of Light, the Heart of Fire, the God of Flame and Shadow. Against him stands the great other, whose name may not be spoken, the Lord of Darkness, the Soul of Ice, the God of Night and Terror. Ours is not a choice between Baratheon and Lannister, between Greyjoy and Stark. It is death we choose, or life, darkness or light. The same theme from the past, reflected in the war against the never-ending darkness in the Long Night, will reoccur, as it's prophesied even by the Stark words, winter is coming, and for this war to be won by the people, Azor Ahai is needed. Or simply, a counterbalancing force of the light must be produced by unison of ice and fire, and win over the darkness that has grown out of proportion again. This is the cycle that's repeating itself throughout history. It works the same way in our world, except that in A Song of Ice and Fire, the core of this duality is represented by ice and fire, and it's done to a literal extent, as it manifests itself through these two elements. Trouble is caused when something third, which disrupts the coexistence of the two, rises. It's as if there were three elements, ice, fire and darkness, which arises from the incongruence between the two, and can only be overcome by their unification. This unification is expressed in the word song, as we'll discuss later. There was a pact of ice and fire made between Starks and Targaryens in the past. A Stark was supposed to marry a Targaryen princess, but nothing came out of it. Just as a side note, if specific names weren't mentioned in the Pact, and unless Rhaegar married Lyanna, the Pact has remained unfulfilled. Therefore, in theory, it could still be valid, and Starks could eventually demand its fulfillment. The name of the Pact clearly indicates that Starks are ice and Targaryens fire. We can therefore potentially conclude that the one whose song is of ice and fire would be the one born of a union of these two houses. And that would be none other than Jon Snow. Or it could mean that Starks, ice, and Targaryens, fire, the apparent opposites, have to be united, song, in order for the war against the darkness to be won. This darkness could be related to the others, but also possibly to Euron Greyjoy, who could be the dark eye that priests Moqorro and Benero portrayed as peril for Daenerys. Or that war must be waged by fire, Targaryens, against ice, the others. There are two, Melisandre emphasized. As there are two gods, there are two warriors, ice and fire, Targaryens, against the opposing force, darkness. And that would be none other than Jon and Daenerys, who are the last legitimate dragons, and at the same time, theirs would be the union of ice and fire. Note, I'm inclined to believe that young Griff is a Blackfire, or the Mammoth Dragon, and his role won't be decisive in the war against the others. He also doesn't fit in with the ice and fire theme, unless he'd be somehow connected to a Stark, which isn't the case at the moment, and neither it'll be from my point of view in the future. This pact, which portrays Starks as ice and Targaryens as fire, may also indicate that Starks and Targaryens have had and will have an imperative role in this cycle. Rhaegar and Lyanna and Jon and Daenerys. The previous era's conflict culminated in Rhaegar Targaryen kidnapping Lyanna Stark. As we know, Rhaegar loved his lady Lyanna, and thousands died for it. And this also ushered in a new era, and possibly Azor Ahai. In this era, we have Jon and Daenerys as the incarnation of ice and fire, with both their differences and similarities, hence my inclination to believe that they will play a decisive role in ushering in another era. This wouldn't make sense for any other two characters, as we don't even know much about young Griff at this point, and he's not either a seasoned fighter or ruler, so even if he were a Targaryen connected to a Stark, which I doubt could be the case, it's difficult to see him in such a crucial role. The point is that it's not about Jon and Dany being a Stark and a Targaryen, but it's first and foremost about their characteristics. They didn't become who they are thanks to their name. They gave that name its significance. I'll talk about these pairings eventually in separate videos, as there's quite a lot to talk about. Overall, the pattern we see is that different generations, or eras, first find themselves amidst a conflict between ice and fire due to one of the two prevailing falling out of balance and producing chaos, which culminates in destruction, and is followed by subsequent restoration of balance between the two elements, usually by unification of the opposite, which creates one party with the same characteristics against the third, disruptive element, for example Night's Watch and Children of the Forest versus the others, or by countering of the prevailing element by the force of the non-prevailing one. For example, Azor Ahai, embodiment of fire and life, against the others, embodiment of ice and death, after which something new was born. This follows the classical principles of the creation myth reoccurring eternally on both the micro and macrocosmic level, found across different cultures. We'll look into that further a bit later. Why did George Martin choose ice and fire specifically? When asked why he named the series A Song of Ice and Fire, George Martin said in an interview that, quote, "People say I was influenced by Robert Frost's poem, and of course I was. I mean, fire is love, fire is passion, fire is sexual ardor, and all of these things. Ice is betrayal, ice is revenge, ice is, that kind of cold inhumanity, and all that stuff is being played out in the books," end quote. The poem was actually inspired by a passage from Dante's Inferno, where the worst offenders are submerged in ice. It's an interesting parallel, given that worst offenders of Westeros, if not beheaded, are sent to the wall. The poem also includes the idea that both ice and fire have the potential to be destructive forces, as has been demonstrated through the events of the Long Night and the Doom. What is a song? In order for something to be called a song, melody must be produced, and melody is a succession of tones perceived as a single unity. Song is then produced by alternating patterns of sound and silence. So, to extrapolate this onto our question, ice and fire represent the circle of life in which the light and the dark vie for the throne constantly, but in which also times of peace are present. The song of ice and fire can be heard when the two unite, or in other words, when the harmony between the two is restored. And that'll be the finale of the book series. But as we know, no song lasts forever. For some time we will hear the sound, but then silence, or that which disrupts the song, will eventually follow. This idea of unison is also confirmed by Melisandre. The Lord of Light in his wisdom made us male and female, two parts of a greater whole. In our joining there is power. Power to make life. Power to make light. Power to cast shadows. So, the principal theme that underlies Game of Thrones is the eternal alternation between the struggle and congruence between fire and ice. Ice must take life only for fire to breathe life into it again. For example, Jon's death amongst snow and possible future revivification by Melisandre, or Daenerys rescued by Drogon in the House of Undying. She was consumed by their cold hands and her heart ceased to beat, so she technically died and was brought back to life by fire. Universally, fire is the life-giving force, ice the life-taking force, but at times it's impossible to distinguish between the two, and their roles can be swapped. An ideal ruler must be able to give life, but also take it when necessary, for which Azor Ahai must be someone who's capable of the two, for which Jon and Dany are ideal candidates. It's also relevant to know that there is simply no just black or just white, just like there are no heroes or villains, as a hero could be a villain for one side and conversely a villain for another. This is the central aspect of George Martin's storytelling, and it's also represented symbolically in Ice and Fire. Therefore, if we look at more nuanced interpretations of the word song in the name of the series, we'll always arrive at something congruent with the general definition. You can hear a song when swords sing. That would simply mean clash of ice and fire, or of the darkness and the light, or of the opposite. for example through the war between the world of the others and those who will fight them, most likely dragons. It's a song sang internally between the opposites. At first, stories weren't written down but passed orally from generation to generation in the form of a song. The name of the series therefore portrays it as an old story. The crucial event which decided the status quo of the world of the story that begins with the book A Game of Thrones is a literal song, a conjunction of ice and fire, a unison between Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen, and the consequent destruction of the old and birth of something new, in this case of the dragons as a consequence and of Jon Targaryen, or the song itself. As we discussed before, song is a result of a unison of tones. His is the Song of Ice and Fire, the prophecy of the prince that was promised, or of Azor Ahai. In this case, we could talk about a melody for a lyric poem or ballad, that is, our prophecy being played out. We can conclude that the prophecy states that the prince that was promised has the Song of Ice and Fire. That could mean that the fate of the person says that his role will be decisive in the clash of ice and fire. He'll unite ice and fire again, or that when ice and fire merge or sing, the resultant song is him. In either case, the person or possibly people will play a crucial role in the story. Songs sang by animals. And as so many houses, especially the crucial ones that fight amongst each other, have animals on their sigils, we have one possible interpretation right there. Ice and fire, the Nordic mythology, paganism, Ragnarok and Game of Thrones parallels. In the Norse creation myth, at first, there was just darkness, Gnangagap, from which eventually sprang a realm of fire, Muspelheim, and a realm of ice, Niflheim. When the air from Muspelheim and Niflheim met, the fire melted the ice, which took the shape of a giant. This giant was called Ymir, and he was the first giant in Norse mythology. Eventually, Ymir's offspring dismembered him and created the world from his remains. Ragnarok, which means fate of the gods or final destiny of the gods, also associated with terms like Alderok, which means end of an age, is prophesied by the seers. Odin calls her mother of three. This refers to her being Angerboda, mother of the Fenris wolf, the Midgard serpent, and the goddess of death, Hel. She's also called Witch of the Ironwood, Mother of Wolves, Mother of the Apocalypse, and Hag of the East Winds. She was burned and resurrected 3 times. During Ragnarok, the bridge Bifrost, meaning the shimmering path, remember that the wall often shimmers in the sun, that connects all the realms, breaks when the sons of Muspelheim, led by Surtur, who wields a flaming sword, cross it. The horn Gjallarhorn is blown, and the world tree Yggdrasil, the entire world, shakes. Surtur, whose name means black, and whose wife is Sinmara, whose name means pale mare, fights and defeats Freyr, a deity whose name means Lord and is sometimes anglicized as Frey. After heaven, earth and the whole world are burned, a beautiful new world will be reborn and rise from the ashes of death and destruction. 2 humans, Leaf and Leafthrasir, will survive and repopulate the earth. The series' vision ends with a dragon from the roots of the world tree bearing corpses in his wings, symbolically representing corruption which never vanishes from the world completely, and the cycle that will repeat itself again. This story also follows the classical principles of the creation myth. Something comes into existence from nothingness, that something is destroyed, returns to nothingness, from which something springs again. We see how the 2 apparently opposed forces rise together, merge, produce, clash, and are annihilated, only for the same cycle to begin again. Because of this, we could predict that the final battle will take place after the wall is cast down. Eventually, the one who will wield Lightbringer will defeat the darkness. A sword is a phallic symbol, and fire symbolizes revival, so we know that this means that life will be brought back and restored. Check out my video about the Hound for an example how fire can destroy the old and lead oneself towards rebirth. Tradition of radical Norse paganism is called the Way of Ice and Fire. Many rituals begin by invoking ice and fire. When one invokes the powers of fire and ice, his calling on the primordial force is responsible for creation of reality as we know it. It's considered summoning the opposing forces, forcing them to collide, and recreating the moment when the world rose from the primordial void. Ice runes are associated with preservation, stagnation and slow change, and fire runes with raw power, potential for destruction, and improvement of people's lives.